Hi, I'm Alex Standen. I'm Head of Academic Development in LSE Eden Centre. And I'm really delighted to welcome Dr Marie Oldfield, who is a Senior Lecturer in Practice in LSE's Department of Mathematics, as well as a whole host of other roles that Marie holds. We're going to be having a conversation today about AI and ethics. And so I'm going to start straight away by inviting Marie to introduce yourself. Thanks, Marie.
Yeah, so I'm a senior lecturer in practice at LSE and I manage the industry projects for the maths department. So I put the students into client projects over summer. I'm on the executive board of the Institute of Science and Technology and I manage my own consultancy, which works in things like legal, statistics, AI, defence, government. My background is quite varied. I'm a humanities person really and languages. However, when I did my degree, I saw that there weren't that many women in maths and also there were lots of jobs in maths and the class sizes were really small. So I thought, let me change to maths. And that's where I've been ever since. And I've never really not had a job, so it's kind of worked out that way. But my background, it kind of turned into half humanities, half maths, because I ended up taking maths with statistics and my PhD was computer science. So it became more about how humans interact with technology and especially how humans interact with AI and how we can build ethical AI and design it ethically, but also communicate about it correctly and be able to design AI that humans aren't disadvantaged by.
That's excellent. Thank you, Marie. And so interesting to hear about that mixed background, which I think does feed really nicely into what we're going to be talking about today, which is some of the ethical questions around generative AI. So I suppose we can start by thinking that for many people, it does seem that some of these tools have appeared overnight. We've talked about this explosion in generative AI tools that are now available to us all. And I think often when we're considering ethics and bias, we perhaps focus a lot on the output of these models. And what we're overlooking is the enormous amount of work that goes into building them and the ethical concerns of those practitioners who are at the heart of the process. And I think a lot of us aren't really close enough to this issue to be able to really think through these questions. So for someone who isn't as close to the issue as you are or as the practitioners are, what do you think it's important for us to be aware of?
I think that there's many aspects that we need to be aware of. The main one is risk and being risk aware, because these tools do carry a substantial amount of risk. They've not appeared out of nowhere. We've been doing modelling for a long time where we've used data and methodology to make decisions and predictions. A lot of tools these days can be more on the automated side rather than, doing standard statistical and mathematical work. These models can be extremely complex. In my view, there isn't a model that shouldn't be transparent. There's no argument for a model to be a black box. You should be able to explain it because we have to build these things. So when we build them, we have to tell them what to do, how to behave, how to process data. We have to collect the data. We have to make sure that data's correct. So there's a lot that goes into making these models safe. And at the beginning of that process, there is a time where you need to think about it and think about the concept and think about the context. Do you really need to build a model? If you do, how are you going to build it? How are you going to collect the data? How are you going to be compliant with any regulation, legislation? These are all things that need to happen, but they don't necessarily happen a lot of the time. I've done a lot of work in government with models, and when you skip that whole first part and don't involve SMEs, models have a tendency to fail really badly. And we've seen that in the last few years in terms of facial recognition, visa algorithms. When you're not paying enough attention to what you're building and you're just building things and putting it out there, the risk increases exponentially, and that's risk to reputation, financial risk. It's risk to life. In a lot of my work in government and defence, it's risk to life. So my best practice that I've developed is based on that, and that's what the Institute of Science and Technology uses for its professional standards and accreditation framework, so that we can accredit professionals. So in the future, what you'll be able to see is practitioners with letters after their name verifying that they've met our standards and they can model ethically. The algorithms and the models that are used are not sat there thinking, they've not got the experience, they're not humans, they're just tools that take in data and they make decisions, and they make the decisions how they're told to make them. And you can't program into that the entirety of human experience. You can only tell it to do certain things in a rule-bound way because that's how we have to code into computers to make them work. There can be lots of rules, there can be conflicting rules, there can be assumptions in there that aren't correctly coded. So decisions from these models can be wrong. It's not impossible. So we need to be able to challenge them and be aware of how our data is used. There's many examples of how people's data has been used in such a way to either expose them on the internet, to put details out there about them that they didn't want to be out there, have their privacy invaded, whether purposefully or not. So the output from the model does matter, but the way that the model is constructed and how you interact with it and how it uses your data is even more important, because if you don't know what data's there and you don't know how the model works, how can you tell if the output is correct or not? We can't. And sometimes we think the output's correct and it isn't, because we've not used the correct data, we've not got the correct methodology. There's a testing issue that wasn't found because maybe they didn't do testing on it. So it's really important. I mean, ethics for me is the modeling process. How have you built this thing? How does it work? What paperwork have you got to support the transparency? Have you validated and verified it? These are all basic things that you need to do that are all part of best practice. And you should be able to have any decision explained to you thoroughly in a manner that you understand. There's no excuse for that.
Thank you so much, Marie. I suppose a kind of one that's not related to us in university. Do you think technology companies are taking the issues and challenges seriously enough? If they're not, is that being addressed at all?
From my industry experience, I think they are. I mean, I did an empirical study as part of my PhD where we looked at multinational corporations, SMEs, up to really large corporations. And I interact with businesses on a daily basis as part of my role at LSE. I think they're taking it extremely seriously. What causes them a problem is the fact that the education's not there and the professional development's not there. So I can go in and make as many talks as I want, but if that underpinning knowledge is not there, then the tendency is to reach for a quick fix, especially in businesses, because they want to maintain their profit margins, they want to be competitive. One of the techniques in my empirical study that I found that businesses do is if they do have a problem in the implementation of AI, they'll try and fix it on the back end with PR, because they need people to continue to trust them. However, that's not appropriate because you've clearly developed a model either incorrectly or unethically. So the processes in the business to do that are not there because there's not been that much attention on best practice. In my opinion, there's been a lot more focused on how can I get funding for things like ethics, which is a really woolly term and we haven't actually really defined it. What is fairness? What is transparency? Well, we can define these all day on a language level or a philosophical level, but what it means is let's be clear, let's communicate, let's involve the right people, and let's build these models in a transparent way.
Thank you, Marie. And I think another thing that's become obvious very quickly is how much for people who are not practitioners, who are not with this background, this seeming advent of generative AI tools has stirred up quite a lot of emotion. And perhaps we're seeing different sets of assumptions amongst those who are more used to using AI tools and those who aren't. There's potential optimism bias amongst industry professionals, mistrust amongst those who don't work in the field. Are you seeing that in your work? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
In my empirical study, I did see some optimism bias. But it's not necessarily bias. It might be because the people that were answering that question did actually have a substantial knowledge of what they were doing, and so therefore were more confident rather than biased about it. It's a human issue where if we look at something and we don't necessarily fully understand it, and these models are very difficult to understand, they're complex, we can then form opinions on it, but they might be emotion driven. And this is something that I talk about in my published work, where you've got an emotionally driven judgment. It might not be necessarily rational or logical, because what you're trying to do is use your experience to form an opinion or a judgment on something that you're not quite sure on. So you're missing a huge amount of information there and already forming some sort of opinion. Also, the media and some apparent expert speakers fuel this. We've had everything from robots to Skynet to, the world's in danger, everybody's job's going to disappear, etc. All this does is fearmonger. And what that does is take our attention off the fact that actually we've got a tangible issue. We've got ways to solve it. We've examined the problem and we've looked at the things that we need to do. So let's start building those building blocks and get to a point where we can build ethical technology instead of just flapping around and saying, where's Terminator coming from? Let's look at how we need to protect society and especially vulnerable people by making sure that we're doing the best job that we can. And another point on that is that there's some inherently human concepts that we need to address. So when we're talking about things like plagiarism in universities and we're talking about ChatGPT, we've got to understand where our line is in terms of editing and work production. Because if you're using a tool, and there are many tools that you can use, thesaurus, spell check, editing software to edit your work, how much editing do we allow to happen before it is work production? If you want to find out if something like ChatGPT or a tool has produced somebody's work, how can you know that? Especially at university, if you're not seeing written work on a regular basis, how can you tell? We've had cases where people have maybe paid other people to write their work and then they've submitted that. We didn't know that that was the case either. So how can we stop these tools being used to produce work? Now, there's another problem because people want to use tools to examine things like ChatGPT to say, well, that's plagiarism. How do we know this other tool works? What transparency and validation and verification do we have on that tool? So if we use another tool to say somebody's plagiarized, we've got no proof. We can't prove that. We can't use Turnitin because it's not necessarily out of any of the standard publications. And if you want to say, well, you know, ChatGPT did produce it, but actually what ChatGPT did was store the paper because it had seen the paper, so it put it into its database. But now it's coming up that ChatGPT has that paper. Well, it might have the paper, but did it produce the paper? So there are really academic intellectual lines there that need to be thought about and explained. And what there is a tendency to do is just to jump to the technology and say the technology is wrong, the technology is biased, we can't figure out what the technology does. Well, actually, in the first place, we need to decide what is plagiarism because that bar is moving and things are changing in that area. Where do we want to set that bar? Because if we do say non-English speakers can do a fair amount of editing and get help with that, then we can't say that if they use ChatGPT to do that, then that's wrong. So we've got to really understand what red lines are in that and then move forward and look at the technology second and say, if this is the case, how do we then use this technology to figure out if plagiarism has taken place? So there's some really sticky issues coming up, but they can't just be solved by reverse engineering with different tools. They're more about us thinking through the problem and then setting what we think our expectations are out before we make a decision.
Thanks so much, Marie. That was really fascinating. So you touched on questions that we all need to be thinking about here in the university space: academic integrity, plagiarism. And we know that staff have understandable concerns about students using tools to aid them in the production of summative assessments. And at the same time, we're seeing a swathe of tools that supposedly allow us to see whether that has happened. You mentioned Turnitin, for example. There are, of course, ethical concerns around the use of student data. What advice would you give to staff who've got these concerns about student work and how to think through that, how to manage it?
There's not a case for uploading your entire class or something. One, because you need to know your students enough to have some sort of indication that there is plagiarism. And if there is, then a knee-jerk reaction of Googling how do I spot plagiarism in ChatGPT and finding a tool and uploading the student's work is not only unethical, I'm sure it breaches some sort of data regulation, but you don't know how that tool works either. And what if in the small print when you sign up to it, the tool takes the data that you've uploaded and then uses it for something else or gives it out on the internet or adds it to a repository? Some of my projects are confidential. So if I started doing that, I'd have a huge amount of issues with industry. We can't do that. We've got to go back to the beginning again. And I keep on saying this, but it is a case of calming down and thinking through. We need to look at what is plagiarism first in terms of editing and production of work. Then we need to look at, analyse and identify through qualified experts what is a way of actually actioning this. So what tool out there can we get that is transparent enough and will tell us what all the terms and conditions are, tell us how it works, tell us how it was built. And we need to do that for ChatGPT as well. This is a case of getting transparency on every model that we're talking about and then seeing what's actually happened. with that work. But in order to get there, there is a process that we need to follow. And it's not just uploading students' work to whatever tool we find. It's so much easier for people to just go and upload things and try and get a result, but it's not ethical. It's got serious impacts, and we've got to think it through first. We are playing catch up, but we need to play catch up in a sensible, coherent manner, not in a knee-jerk, fear-driven manner.
One thing you've written about in the field of AI technologies, ethics are often seen as a barrier to innovation. In our university context, both amongst staff and student communities, there's perhaps a sense that we're playing catch up with AI tools. So how can we make sure that ethics aren't set aside in the process of learning and remain a part of the upskilling process for both our staff and students?
Currently at the IST, we are doing a project on this in terms of educational frameworks, how you use tools in the classroom, how students perceive the tools, how they would like to be taught, how educators need to be informed. At the minute, there's few resources to give you the expert knowledge that you need to be able to either choose tools, use tools, understand the risk associated with whatever tool it is that you're using. And therefore, it's difficult to communicate what you should actually do. I mean, in the past, I'd be making my own tools in mathematics rather than just using different tools. So if I'm using a tool, I want to know, how does it work? What is the transparency? How is it developed? How does it use the data? The new tools aren't validated on things like existing statistical methodology like my tools in the past were. So it's important to understand how they work. It's a real burden on educators to be able to do that. So we do need resources that are able to give us that information. If we teach students tools and we don't give them the risks associated with it or the understanding of the tool, these students will then go out into industry and they'll start programming using these tools or just using them. And we do have tools where you can just click and collect. You can just click certain things and it says, right, okay, your tool does this, but you're not sure if it does because you can't see the code behind it, or maybe you never did coding. Or even if you did, if you can't access the code, you can't understand it. So then you've got a lot of people out there that are all building models that aren't really aware of the ethical way of building them, or aren't aware of the way that they would have to work to understand them. And in academia, we work on a principle of critical awareness. So we want to critique things, we want to understand them, we want to make sure that we're understanding the different angles that we might see within these tools. But again, the resources just aren't there. So it's a really difficult problem at the minute.
Okay, and I suppose the last question, and I think you've already touched on it a little bit, but just thinking about our individual educators, our departments, programme leads perhaps here at the LSE, what steps might people consider taking if they're starting to think about the role they would like AI to play in their teaching, assessment, course design, or of course, if they would like to think about it not having that role?
It's an intellectual exercise. You can't start from the point of view of what tool and how. You have to go back to pedagogical concerns. You have to go back to, what do I need students to know? What will equip them for their future role? If I want to bring tools in, which there's no restriction on bringing tools in. Some of the tools are really good that are out there. Some are really beneficial and can save us time, can save us money, but also give us insights that we might not have had before. So we need to be able to use these tools because they are there. We are going to be facing a future that is increasingly proliferated by technology. So we need to understand it because that understanding is critical. I would say that students and staff need to understand how these models are made. There's a process for that and it's fairly straightforward, but it gives you the questions that you need to ask to make sure that you are assured of what it is that you're using and how you're going to use it and what the risks are. If you can't get those answers, then I would suggest you don't use the tool, because if you can't understand the risk and how it works, then that just puts exponential risk out there once that tool starts to be used. So it's really a case of, when you're designing your curriculum, firstly, it's the knowledge that the students need to have and how you're going to teach that. Secondly, or even later than secondly, it's what tools can facilitate that learning. And if I want to bring tools in, how do I assure that I'm using these tools correctly and that I'm not, and I hesitate to say this, but it is a fact, that I'm not causing downstream damage by bringing these tools in and students taking them out into the workplace and maybe not using them correctly, or maybe not understanding the risks and then using them in a way in which the tool was not intended.
Okay, thank you so much, Marie. This has been really, really fascinating to hear from you. And we're so grateful to you for giving all this time to help us as we support and think through these questions here at the school in support of our staff and student communities. What we'll do is link the publications that you've mentioned, your papers, to the bottom of this video so people can explore further.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.